Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Connection, a dual podcast bridging esports and gaming news between Korea and the West. The Connection covers all topics gaming and esports from Korea, with selective deep dives each week. If you're watching live on Twitch, chat is open for participation, and if you're on YouTube, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm your host, Chobra, which you would know if you're here on Twitch and hopefully on YouTube as well, but if you don't, I've worked in esports starting as a translator and reporter, all throughout being a commentator, a host, and also a producer, both in Korea and the United States. So that's my background, or brief summary of my background, if you're wondering where I'm getting all this information. Currently, I reside in Korea, so this news is coming hot right from the source. Well, then let's get started with some overall news in the past week. On the gaming front, we can always look forward to checking in on the PC Cafe rankings in Korea, essentially which online games were played the most at PC cafes. This is a bigger deal than you might expect if you're not accustomed to hearing about this or not sure how it works. PC cafes are just so core to how gaming is consumed in Korea and how a lot of entertainment for the younger generations is consumed in Korea. And basically which games dominate the PC cafes tends to really determine just what the current trend is. These days, compared to the past, I guess personally owned computers or laptops are more common, but still PC cafes are very widely used by all sorts of age groups and different gaming groups as well. Well, this week, the top dogs didn't really have the slightest movement. It's your usual suspects, League of Legends at the top, followed by PUBG, FIFA Online, which is actually huge here, by the way, Overwatch, and MapleStory, the original, not MapleStory 2, followed by a few local favorites, which may have had, one or two rank changes, like Dungeon & Fighter, StarCraft, and Lost Ark Online. A few noteworthy movements, however, outside of the top 10, were the positive impact of Apex Legends' release of Season 4. As it goes with gamers worldwide, drop new content and you'll draw eyes. Apex has a long way to go if they want to consistently capture an audience at the PC cafes here, so we'll have to wait and see how this goes, but it is at least good news to hear the release didn't drop on deaf ears, because there have been plenty of games which lost their player base initially and weren't able to capture them back both in Korea and in other regions of the world as well. A bigger piece of news, actually, within the PC Cafe rankings is perhaps the rise of Warcraft 3 Reforged despite the terrible release status it had worldwide. While the reviews and sentiments were no different in Korea, the return of Warcraft 3 Legends to the forefront and tournaments has certainly drawn attention to the game and brought back quite a few players. It's been stated that Blizzard is working to make right by the fans, so we'll see if they can deliver and if it's also quick enough for the Korean audience. Meanwhile, in other news of new games in Korea, Counterside was released, which is a new mobile game from the initial producers of Closers, which is an action game under Nexon. As a mobile RPG, it'll be interesting to see how it fares against Arknights, which seemed to take Korea by wave initially as well. The reactions to the prior closed beta test noted a lot of issues, but their initial changes are keeping fans hopeful. The consensus so far seems to be that the gameplay is fun and engaging, but the currency and resources and maybe even some of the graphics need a lot of work. Regarding PUBG esports decline trickling into the PC cafes, I would say that it still has a really good grip within the PC cafes. The actual numbers may have shifted a little bit, but as it goes just within the Battle Royale and even FPS and third-person shooter genres, it's still the dominant game here in Korea. Absolutely, there's no questions asked about that. Going back to new game news, Metal Unit was personally a game I liked reading about because in the age of indie games galore worldwide, it's always interesting to follow indie games from Korea. The game has entered early access on Steam, and while the action seems good, the initial reviews are stating that the story is a bit lacking and it doesn't seem to offer anything too new. Which not every game has to, but overall, I feel that Korean fans have been hoping for more breakthroughs from Korea as well, considering that gaming in Korea grew so much in its own bubble throughout all this time. Regarding the story portion, yeah, action RPGs or roguelites don't have to be so focused on the story. The only issue is they seem to try to market this game as a very story-driven game, including, like deep storylines and things like that along their tags on Steam. So I think the expectations were a little bit off. if you are interested in action-based roguelites, go ahead and check out some of the footage on Steam and online and see for yourself. The game is called Metal Unit. Now going over to esports. On the esports front, well, LCK at Champions Korea continues without an audience due to coronavirus, with no signs of letting up anytime soon. I mean, really, we just have to wait, which is unfortunate, but thankfully, obviously, the matches are going on, and we get to see the coverage online. The Overwatch League kicked off with its fair share of difficulties on the English broadcast, but it seems, unfortunately, things were worse on the Korean side. Obviously, any relayed broadcasts, or more commonly called piggyback broadcasts, have one or more extra points of potential failure, so it's not surprising, but considering that the core fan base has been growing disgruntled with the game and the league, the difficulties did not help Blizzard at all. The most worrying aspect is that this only perpetuates the outcry within Korea, and I want to say probably worldwide, that Blizzard is no longer the company we once loved. And it's dug up some old disappointments around StarCraft 2 as well here in Korea. So people are starting to look negatively upon the massive investment into a league without building up a balanced and stable game first. There's definitely more to talk about behind that, but that's the fan reaction. They're getting unhappy, and then they look back and say, you know what, this is what happens when you just jump headfirst right into a league. On an exciting note for all the RPG and action game fans out there, Smilegate, the company behind Lost Ark Online, which is a MMORPG with action elements, so basically think Diablo-type games but online, seem intent on utilizing esports as a way to increase the enjoyment of their game. The company held their first PvP tournament in January, which was received better than expected. The game itself is under questionable response, mostly about the balance of the different classes, etc., and then also the gameplay loops when you're playing PvE or even PvP online. But the player base is still there, and it would be interesting if they can make sure the game development, balance, and esports all work together. I think it's much more interesting to also note that obviously we've also seen just a huge resurgence, if not just a new direction of growth, with MMORPG-based esports content, specifically with World of Warcraft when it comes to a global audience. And so to see these different MMORPGs try to see how they can tackle esports or just competitive gaming in that sense and what works for their own game will be very interesting, and I think offers a lot of different options. Personally, I've always thought speedrunning or certain elements or certain titles of speedrunning could translate really well as well within esports and competitive coverage, so RPGs are definitely within the scope. Not Black Desert Online. This would be Lost Ark Online, which is a different game, but it is a top-down action RPG. So for those interested, Lost Ark Online hosted a 3v3 PvP arena, basically tournament through OGN earlier on in the year, and it appears through interviews that their teams internally are also fairly happy with how it went. They definitely didn't expect as much of a response in terms of viewership and also coverage. So hopefully this does motivate them to continue running more tournaments along those lines. Now that we've got a lot of the headlines covered, let's dive into a topic that could get a little bit deep. Not sure how much we'll be able to talk about it today, as I wasn't ready to dive into something so deep early on in this project, but it is timely, so we'll give it a shot. So League of Legends fans will most likely remember the massive case that broke out last year revolving around CV Max, the coach, Kanavi, a player, and then Griffin as an organization. If you're not aware, I won't go too much into it since there's a lot of aspects to cover, but the two core aspects were legal and or immoral contracts, and then player abuse. Today we're talking a bit more about the contract portion and not the player abuse portion, because that has a whole lot of other things we could cover regarding the actual case itself, and then culture in Korea and the history of esports teams and coaches in Korea, etc. That's a whole different rabbit hole that we'll probably cover in a later episode, but today it's about the contracts. Since the spotlight landed on the Kanavi case last year, there have been other coming out moments in Korea from players who suffered similar fates. When the case led to further drama between Riot Korea, CV Max, and Griffin, an online petition was created to demand a new investigation. While Riot Korea also responded by stepping back on the unfair punishments against CV Max, the Korean government responded publicly earlier this year on the petition and overall case. In it, they noted efforts that they want to take to prevent any similar happenings in Korean esports. The two main notes were A, creating a standard for esports player contracts, and B, expanding and stabilizing the registration of esports players. For those not aware, KESPA has begun, some level of registering pro players as official pro players, etc., but this is run more by KESPA, and it's somewhat isolated just within titles that they cover. And the reaction or the response earlier this year was straight from the government, saying that they want to make this, a national thing. With all this, there were further investigations last year about player contracts across different titles. Different titles, leagues, and KESPA itself, actually, resulting in the reveal that KESPA standard contract guidelines included a clause to essentially sell players to other teams without the player's agreement. Not only was this considered an unfair clause, it was also brought to attention that esports players are generally much younger than in other fields, which meant the contracts will allow teams to transfer players under the age of 20 to foreign regions at will. KESPA responded that they would remove this clause and create a new standard last year. So earlier this month, they announced a new standard contract would be used moving forward, and this was announced only a couple days before LCK kicked off. But it turns out that while the clause includes that there must be a discussion and or negotiation with the players at hand, it does not require an agreement by both parties, which means it still allows organizations to transfer players at will. The Korean Fair Trade Commission immediately responded that this is still an unfair clause and that this must be changed. Some internal members of KESPA responded that this is not going to be taken well by the organizations and also makes things a little difficult for KESPA, but the FTC still stands by its ruling. It appears certain other clauses were also left as is, despite the backlash from the public and the FTC. Some of these revolve around basically who holds certain rights and or monetary rights or other content rights when it comes to players after their contract has ended. This has only drawn more negative attention upon KESPA from the public, and rightfully so. For those not aware, KESPA is an esports association here in Korea that has ties to the government but is not an official government body. And it was created as a association for the orgs and not necessarily players. A lawyer in the industry actually comments on this and responded to the news saying that the limits of a KESPA standard contract is clear, given that KESPA will always prioritize the orgs over players. And again, that goes back to how KESPA was created and what it stands for. It actually stands for the orgs and not the players themselves. The lawyer also added that a government-issued contract is needed as soon as possible, but unfortunately, it looks like we'll have to wait until the end of this year, at the very least, for that to come through. While I'm no lawyer, so I don't have the expertise to speak on detailed matters per se, this is obviously a problem. And personally, I hate to hear any blanket arguments of, oh, that's just how things are in this field or any other related field, because that's just a poor excuse. Certain aspects of esports are definitely different than other sports or entertainment and require a new angle, but then that effort should be put in. We shouldn't cost basic rights and needs just for the sake of simplicity and efficiency. It's also just a shame that this is happening here in Korea, a place that prides itself on its esports and gaming history. Even the government response to the petition earlier this year was heard saying that they think this is an embarrassment for Korea that has such a rich history in the field. Fans are also starting to lash out once again against KESPA, saying it shouldn't even hold the K out front of its name and give the wrong impression that they represent the country. If we want to look at this from an economic, cultural, even anthropological angle, things go much, much deeper. Like, much deeper. There's all sorts of takes we can have here on why this happens and why it's been left alone for so long as well. There's obviously the Confucianism-based culture, the need to be number one to be accepted in anything here in Korea, the overall economy of Korea and where that lies, and a lot of politics as well. Government involvement when it comes to legal aspects is a good thing, but I think the most important thing is that the power of the internet continues to be used for good in these cases. Right now, everyone's all up in arms about justice, etc., but given how we are exposed to the internet, it's very easy for us to lose sight of what we're actually fighting for. I think the reason there's more movement and coverage today within esports is really because information is just more readily available and shared. And I think this is important to note that a lot of the exclusive breakthroughs and coverage regarding these player contracts actually came from a press called 국민일보, which is a long-standing and has a deep history within news coverage here in Korea. So it's not just an esports coverage or esports organization that's covering these cases. It actually just went at a complete public scale, obviously with the government involved. That is to be expected. But that says a lot about how things are changing here in Korea as well when it comes to esports and different standards. As for how is this going to resolve? Honestly, I'm not too sure. Mostly because Korea currently has a lot going on politically as well. And it's honestly quite a headache for someone who's exposed to both American and Korean politics on the regular. So time will have to tell how gaming and esports is affected by it, if at all. Which, if it's not affected, would be a little unfortunate because that means everything kind of stays the same despite all this movement. I don't want to get into too much politics, but we'll have to keep an eye on these movements as the year goes by. I would also just love to hear what changes you would like to see in esports to make sure it grows in a healthy direction. Obviously, at a global level, esports is, or I say, for the past 2-3 years even, it's been in this constantly changing state, both in terms of scale and direction. And I think a lot of different people are trying different methods when it comes to what's required, what's healthy, and also what's needed for future development. Later on today, when I do the Korean version, I'm going to talk about Flashpoint and obviously how we've seen certain changes in movement within the CSGO community and pro scene regarding player representation. And then I think that enters a bigger discussion on how leagues are ran, right? Which is the healthiest, or maybe it just really depends on the genre, the market, and some other factors. Are we looking at things being safest when they're all internalized, like we see with Riot or even Blizzard and Activision? Are we seeing, is Dota in a healthy state with the way that Valve has taken a bit of a indirect hands-on approach? Or is CSGO the right way to go, where from a game developer standpoint, it's pretty lax, or rather a bit of a free-for-all, and players really just stand up for themselves and start to take initiative when it comes to representing themselves? I think there's a lot to talk about at a global level, and I'll be sharing some of that with the Korean audience in the Korean version of this podcast later today. But currently for Korea, government involvement regarding player contracts is the first step. Derlo says, I think the development of player associations and having strong representation for players is really important, with the Kespa scandal and then ESL as well for CSGO. Yeah, I think I agree. Personally, I will go ahead and say that I'm not entirely sure where the fine line needs to be drawn regarding, player associations and who has certain powers when it comes to how a tournament is ran. I'm also just of the party where I think having different interests and priorities is very good for something to run well. But that's a very generic statement, right? And obviously players having representation does not mean they run everything, including the referees. So there's obviously a difference there. But what I mean is, how far does it need to go? I think further than currently is probably the right answer, but I don't know where it ends and then where it's connected with a different party and someone else taking control of certain other aspects. So it'll be very interesting to see these different organizations take their own initiatives and really test the waters. We're still very early on in that stage. I think people still forget, because of how fast esports has grown this time around, that it's just a very young industry, right? This new wave started in 2010, 2011. So we're barely 10 years old with this iteration. Obviously, esports has been around longer in the past, but I think it had many waves and many bubbles. And this time, it's growing faster and I guess for a longer period of time and at a much larger scale, just thanks to how the tech industry has grown and how entertainment is consumed. But it's still only 10 years. When you look at the grand scope of things, there's a lot to learn and a lot to test. So we will have to wait and see. As for the mainline topics, that's it for today's episode of The Connection. A bit of a heavy one. I tried to keep it pretty brief, and it looks like I actually maybe made it a little too short, but I wanted to err on the side of being short rather than droning on for too long, because especially with political or cultural topics, I could talk for days on end. But this will surely be something that we visit again, especially because both the Konami case itself, or not the Konami case, but rather the CV Max case itself, and player contracts are requiring more responses from the government and all the parties involved. So we'll have to wait and see how that one goes. But I think it was good to touch upon it today, because now when we have updates, we can kind of check back in rather than having to open the entire can of worms from the get-go and then not be able to cover all the details as we need. For now, we'll have a little bit of time just to chit-chat about various topics when it comes to gaming and esports, and then I will be diving back into Disco Elysium on the stream. And also, all that info premiered for The Division 2, by the way. That's something that I'm very excited for. So there's a lot of gaming available, and when it comes to esports, it almost feels like too much content available for all of you who are big fans of esports or even working in esports. If you enjoyed the podcast live, feel free to hang out, as my stream is open to both Korean and English in chat. I try to balance my stream between single-player, story-based games for language and cultural translations, and then a handful of online games like Escape from Tarkov and League of Legends. And if you're watching on YouTube, let me know your responses or questions in the comments below. And if you liked what you heard, a like and a subscribe would go a long way. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, game responsibly, and we'll cross this bridge again next week on The Connection.